All right, so the last video we left off discussing this topic of racial bias. Now we're going to go ahead and watch a short video that just provides further information about what racial bias is and how we come to develop racial bias as being products of the societies that we live in.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an overrepresentation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
So hopefully that video was kind of helpful unpacking this complicated and often difficult subject. I really like the metaphor they use in there that racism is a fog, right? It's like this fog that we have constantly been breathing in, that we've been exposed to our entire life, but we haven't been taught to identify it or to recognize that it's there. And a lot of the examples that they provided in that short video clip, things like media representations, the images that we see in advertisements, etc., all of these different social structures in our society that, again, were built upon the premise of racism. The United States was founded on racism. And these racial biases that have been inherently built into social structures like media, education, healthcare, etc., are still present today, but they're so kind of innocuous and scary because we're taught not to recognize them as furthering racial bias, right? So here's just one example, considering how the media portrays white people and people of color differently, specifically when they break the law, right? So this is a website screenshot from the exact same news company reporting similar crimes, but reporting them very, very differently when the perpetrators are white versus African-American men, right? So for example, this left image, the headline reads, 3 University of Iowa wrestlers arrested, burglary charges pending. The image on the right says, Coralville police arrest 4 in burglary investigation, all right? Look at how the images of these men are different, right? Look at this. When it's 3 white men, we're emphasizing their prestige, their educational status, right? Emphasizing that they're college students. We're emphasizing the prestige that's associated with being a student athlete. And then the pictures. Instead of using their mugshots when these 3 men were arrested, we're using what appears to be photographs that were likely taken from the university, maybe for the wrestling homepage, or, perhaps some other prestigious organization, they're wearing jackets, shirts, and ties. And then on the image on the right here, we have the mugshots of these 4 African American men who were arrested for the exact same crime, right? Right, so just look at this. These messages that are being portrayed in the media are subliminally racist, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the broadcaster or the news reporter who wrote these stories, who found these images, is intentionally racist, but there was some sort of subliminal message in their mind, whoever created these news stories on this website, that said, all right, these white boys who got arrested should be portrayed as individuals who you wouldn't have think would have committed this crime, who kind of broke the mold, and so I need a picture that displays that. But when it's people of color, specifically men of color, they automatically get portrayed in this negative light. Right? So these subliminal messages, we see these headlines on the news. When you see an African American man being portrayed like this, right? When you see a mugshot of an African American man in stark juxtaposition to this professional looking photograph of a white person wearing a suit and tie, think of how that rewires your brain to view and perceive people of color in comparison to white people in this context, right? Now again, this isn't saying that all people are racist in our society, but we all have racial bias. Every single one of us in the United States, it's inevitable because, again, we are built in a society that was established on racism. Institutionalized racism is built within the structures of our society. And so these subliminal messages, that fog of racism, is something that we have all been surrounded by our entire lives living here. Okay, we are all exposed to racist ideals, beliefs, and values that marginalize people of color. And as a result, we are all socialized to have racial bias. And like I stated in the previous presentation, this is true even for people of color, right? Studies have found that even people of color think that white people are better, that they have certain privilege, or that they should be privileged and afforded to. There's some really powerful studies that were done decades ago, and they had since been replicated more recently, asking really young children, right? We're talking 2, 3, 4-year-old children, giving them a variety of different dolls to play with, and the dolls representing people of different races. And what they consistently find is that not only are white children more likely to want to play with the white dolls, but even children of color are more likely to say that they would prefer to play with the white doll than with the dolls that represent people of color. So these, again, are behaviors that are learned from a very young age. And they're learned because when you think of who gets displayed in the media, who do you see as being casted as being the superheroes, or the protagonists in different stories that we read as children, or TV shows that we see, or movies that we watch, it's predominantly white people who get displayed as being the good guys, right? And this is true as we get older and start looking at media. Look at the comparison between the way a white person is displayed in a news story versus how a person of color is displayed, right? This does not mean that we are all racist, but it does mean that we all have been subconsciously conditioned to privilege whiteness, to prefer whiteness over any sort of minority racial categorization. And if we ever want to have a society where racism no longer exists, if we can ever dream of getting to that kind of utopian style of society, we need to recognize our own racial biases, and we need to actively work to correct them. So here's one more video that just gives us some suggestions for how we can recognize racial bias that we have in our own lives.
Let's look at how to measure bias in ourselves and in others. Here's Dolly Chug from NYU.
We sent emails to real professors in real universities.
They contacted over 6,500 professors at random from 260 American universities.
We sent them an email that looked like it came from a real person asking for a meeting to learn more about the PhD program in that university. But we randomly assigned whether the fictional person sending that email had a name that sounded male or female, and sounded white, Chinese, Hispanic, Indian, or Black. What we found that is if you were a white male, you were far more likely to receive a response back than if you were in all those other categories put together as a group.
Some of this could be explicit racism, but it's far more likely that in many cases, these professors are just busy. They can't respond to every email they get, so they kind of let their subconscious decide for them. And that's where their biases come through. Research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't. And we tend to help people who are similar to us. But you aren't 6,500 randomly selected professors. So how can you figure out where you might be making similar unconscious choices? First, there's a well-known test online you can take that can help show you biases you hold. Or
just do an audit. Whatever data you have, whether it's formal data in a computer or whether it's just data that's sort of anecdotal, look at the data. For example, I met this fantastic executive in Silicon Valley. He takes great pride in being someone who actively tries to achieve gender balance on his teams, knowing that Silicon Valley and tech are skewed heavily male.
So he looked at his professional social network, his Twitter, his LinkedIn.
He found his network was far more skewed male than he expected. So there's a place where he could actively work to shift that, and that's what he's been doing since then.
So this is not a scientifically exact self-audit, but it can still be useful. And you can audit anything. So maybe start by taking that online test for bias. Maybe check out whose emails you're replying to. But you can also audit yourself for implicit bias by asking a friend to observe you in the real world. If you're a teacher, have people look at who you call on most in class, whatever your interactions are.
One practical thing that people should do is take stock of their friends. It would be very useful for people to actually make lists of people with whom they spend time.
Look for patterns. That's the audit. That's the assessment we can all do.
So a lot of helpful information in that video, and I like a lot of the suggestions that they have to offer. The importance of doing self-checks. You know, if you are one of these people that's, again, having a really hard time acknowledging that or even accepting the idea that you might have racial bias, I would encourage you to do one of those self-edits or audits. Write a list, write a list of all of the friends you can think of and organize them based off of their perceived race. Something I've encouraged my students to do before is to open up your cell phone or log on to Facebook or your Instagram account and scroll through your pictures and look, how many pictures do you have of people that are of a race other than your own, right? You might be surprised. I know I was when I did this study. For a long time, I grew up in the Midwest in a small town in North Dakota where I was predominantly surrounded only by white people. So maybe at that time I could have used that as an excuse of not being exposed to a lot of diversity. But then as I left my small hometown and went to college and started living in cities that had a lot more diversity, I still predominantly only hung out with people of my own race. And it wasn't until I recognized that and realized, wow, maybe I do have a bias about wanting to mostly associate myself with people who I think I'm similar to. I needed to recognize that first before I could actually correct that, So there's small things that we can all do, but it's important to first and foremost recognize that every one of us is going to have some form of racial bias. You can also try taking this implicit association test that they've been referring to. If you simply Google implicit association test, it will redirect you to that page. The tests aren't perfect. There are some scientific and methodological flaws and concerns with them, but by and large, they can be helpful. It's just kind of this somewhat subjective way to assess whether or not we do have any sort of biases across different demographics, from race to gender to sexuality, age, etc. All right. So in the next video, we'll finish by looking at a few more instances of how racial bias actually manifests into discriminatory acts in our society, and we'll take a closer look at white privilege. We'll apply theoretical perspectives to the concept of race, and then we'll also talk about some productive solutions to hopefully lessen the racism or racial bias that we have in our own lived experiences.